Hi. Just wanted to say thank you so much to Sasha and Barbara and everybody at Typographics for having me. It's a real honor to be here, so thank you. My name is Rosie Garschina. I am a creative director at Trollback & Company. I am also a designer by trade. I came up through the ranks in print, designing books and getting my hands dirty in bookmaking. But then I kind of transitioned into being an animator midway through my career, and have worked at some of these studios, agencies, and consultancies. I've been lucky enough to work at all of the categories of places to work, so studio, agency, consultancy, and I think, recently I've really pivoted to focusing a lot on kinetic branding, kinetic motion identities, and media and entertainment, and then also just threading motion throughout brand identities and in other categories outside of media and entertainment. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that work today and what that means for me and what I think that means for branding in general and the power of motion that it could have to really create emotive resonance and differentiation. And so what does that mean? So just kind of looking at some of my most recent work, I think, I've used motion as a way to really build a brand's expression, build a brand's personality. And so we talk about personality a lot when it comes to the style of a typeface or, a color palette or a hero graphic, but how can motion really define a brand's personality in a truly emotive way and drive emotion? And then also as a point of difference, how are we differentiating the brand through motion and where it lives everywhere? And so just some kind of quick examples of that are, streaming services. I do a lot of streaming services, a lot of entertainment brands, and this is, motion is inherent in all of those. Motion lives on your TV screen. Motion lives in Apple TV Plus. It lives in Prime. In this case, we use motion as a way to extend the AMC box. We said you're out-of-the-box thinkers, you're risk takers, you're bold, and so let's create a highlighting device that speaks to your level of curation when it comes to content and that bold avant-garde thinking. And so that was a very obvious way to use motion as a way to speak to the brand's offering. What I've done recently is really try to infuse motion into brands that aren't, historically media and entertainment companies, and think about how to use motion as a way to create a visceral connection as it integrates with typography, as, in Sesame Street, for example, really bringing the joy and the playfulness of that brand's personality through the behavior of the typography. And then also thinking about just sort of how to create a signature behavior. This is something that I did for TeenNick recently, which is really about articulating, the audience, this niche audience of kids who are coming out of being tiny 6, 7, 8-year-olds and moving their way into adulthood and feeling this sense of transition and flux and change and development and experimentation, discovering who they are. How do we articulate that place for the audience in a way of just saying the brand is always in flux, the brand is always moving, the brand is always alive and in a state of transition, and using motion to convey that. So I'm just going to take you through a couple different ways that I use motion to apply to type systems, to apply to strategy, to apply to different emotional triggers that brands are looking to create. And so I've sort of organized them in terms of 3 case studies that speak to 3 different ways that you can use this tool. And so thinking about distinction, TeenNick was all about creating a distinct, ownable personality for that brand that speaks to that audience that can scale. Sesame Street was all about, speaking about the emotion that the brand wants to have, the connection that the brand wants to have to kids, to educators, to philanthropic organizations. And then thinking about a sense of place and grounding, and typography does that too, thinking about a time that we're trying to replicate and recreate. And so just starting with TeenNick, this is really about trying to modernize a teen audience. As you can see, typography and motion were inherent in the brand when we came into it. But there wasn't really any sense of scale. There wasn't any sense of a core behavior that was clearly identifiable that we could then scale into individual personality traits. And so what we did is we took a step back, we looked at the audience. This is you'll see Zac Efron here, you'll see Drake, you'll see a couple other familiar faces. But what was so amazing about this was that children's branding I find to be so interesting because, 2 years in children's branding is like 20 years in adulthood. It's like you move the needle ever so slightly, and it's just so different. And so we were trying to capture this state of experimentation and discovery that the kids were in, because they were 8 years old, they're no longer kids, but they're not yet adults, and they're craving the sense of independence, but they don't have it yet. And so they're in this really weird, awkward, tense state of their lives. And so they're in between. And so what we did is we took a look at this kind of in-between state of flipping and turning and finding this unique moment and discovering who they are, and really imbuing that in the type system and saying, okay, so this state of transition that you're in is now going to be the hero defining characteristic of the brand, the state of flux, the state of permanent transition. And so we looked at typefaces that have, almost like you've hit pause on a moving image. We looked at different ways of using kinetic typography to play the sense of being in a state of flux or being in a state of perpetual motion. And then we started to imbue that in the brand. We started to create a motion behavior that was communicating the state of transition that the kids were in. We applied that to a display typeface, and we said, okay, now the display typeface is going to drive the architecture of the brand. Not only is it going to be a display typeface that moves, but it's going to drive the architecture of the screen. It's going to create many modules that you can put content into, you can put messaging into. It's going to create a responsive grid system with the type driving the entire thing. And so we're really inspired by this core behavior as a way to kind of inform the brand expression. Let's layer, some photography on top of it. Let's make it feel more textural. And so we really started to play with this core behavior, this responsive grid system that was all driven by this type, that was all driven by this kind of state of mind of the audience. And then we took it a step further, and we shot some things, we put the content in, and then we took this core behavior and we kind of scaled it. And so if you look here, we're not stretching, we're folding onto itself. We're folding again. We're kind of extending this language into a couple different tonal ranges. Using variable typefaces, getting thicker and thinner, stretchy, droopy, kind of wet and melting. And so really just extending this language, using different typefaces, but all kind of underneath this umbrella of being in a state of flux. Using dimension to blow things up, repetition, moving through typefaces. And then coming back to our core behavior of this type that's really driving the grid and driving the architecture. And so this is just sort of an overview of how we've, taken sort of the core audience, the place that audience is in, and try and articulate that through a core motion behavior that's differentiating that brand, and then scaling that. And so this is a really exciting project for me, and I think it's kind of woven itself into some of my more recent work and really inspired, how motion can play such a critical role. Obviously, it's one of many ingredients in the recipe, but it can really unlock a lot of things. So then looking at emotion, and this is something I did recently for Sesame Street, which is trying to unite two brands. So looking at Sesame Workshop, which is the umbrella nonprofit brand that lives above everything, and then Sesame Street, which is more of the media and entertainment side. And so these both brands in one place. There was no unification, there was no system, there was no visual identity. Somewhat, but they wanted to build on it, but they really wanted to use motion as a way to articulate that brand's purpose, because they're all about such an amazing organization, really creating real impact, and that's what Sesame Workshop is about. It's, really getting in there, going to Ukraine, working with refugees, working with families, working with kids who, really have social and emotional needs, and creating that emotional connection, and through that emotional connection, impact, real, actual sustainable impact. And so their philanthropic work, they said, okay, we have no emotion in our brands right now, but we have these emotive principles. How can you build on these emotive principles as a way to use motion to articulate that emotion that you get from the brand, and then by way of that, articulate the impact that the brand has? And so we looked at Sesame Street and Workshop side by side. And so Sesame Street is really joyful and playful. It's the Muppets. You feel the texture of the fur. You want to have fun. You want to enjoy that connection that you're having with those Muppets. And then Workshop is they're visionary. They're paving the way for education. They're very experimental in their practices, and they're leading the way, and they wanted to communicate. Those are the two emotions that they wanted to communicate with. And so the feeling of it, you had to feel immersed in it. You had to feel pulled into it by the camera. And you had to feel a tactile sensibility. We wanted the patterning and the fur to really have an emotive quality to it. And also the emotion of having that impact in terms of being in the moment, being in a space that you feel really, really immersed in. And so what we did is we started with the iconic street sign, and we built little mini micro worlds around that. So really, really detailed and close spaces that feel really tactile and visceral, like you're inside of these little mini micro worlds. We use grass, we use fur, we use more fur, we use more fur, more fur. And what is so amazing about this is that you just have the sign, you have the fur, you have the color, you know it's Oscar, you know it's Sesame Street. So we had so much to work with and so much to build on in that way. And so we created, a whole kind of suite of these little micro spaces that you were supposed to like really feel part of and inside of. And so we built on that, and we created a motion behavior that brought that all to life. So using patterning, using Z-Space to create this sort of immersive portal into and out of actual Sesame Street. And then the typeface and the playfulness of the typeface is supposed to communicate that joy that you feel, that playful joy that you feel when you get that connection with the brand. And so we did that across several different assets. And then laddering up to the fur and the logo. I'm going to play that again. So the playfulness of the behavior of the type is in there, and then the immersive quality of being pushed in and out of these windows is in there as well. So just kind of recapping Sesame Street. From there, we went to workshop. And workshop is, really where the impact is, where the real work is, where, they're really partnering with, philanthropic organizations, nonprofits, all over the world. They're in 150 countries. And so we like to say that Sesame Workshop is the longest street in the world. And it's not just, one street, it's my street, it's your street, it's a block in every part of the world, and we're connecting that through a global network of streets that all come together. And so what we did is we took the initial logo that we had designed 5 years ago, and we extended it into a grid, into a network of communities and partnerships. And, it's really about from our street to your street, building new streets, new intersections, new collaborations, new communities, and then coming back to that emotive principle, they want to be bold and visionary and experimental. And so let's expand that grid. Let's create intersections for that grid. Let's have overlap. Let's have collaboration. Let's have more color to speak to the visceral, to speak to the experimental quality of the brand and how it's pushing forward. And let's do this across the world in 150 countries, all coming out of the logo. And so what we did is we created two core behaviors. One is the type has this sort of kind of wash of color moving through it, which is meant to communicate this idea of experimentation, risk-taking, leading the way. And then the street signs are coming from opposite ends, and they intersect and are meant to articulate collaboration. And then we did this in many different ways. Now you're creating new blocks and moving through it. And then, again, across the world, the global reach, 150 countries, all through the equity of the sign. So this is kind of wrapping up Sesame Street. Again, really wanting to communicate the emotive principle of being visionary, being a collaborator, being on the forefront of education, being bold, and using motion as a way to really, really bring that to life. And then wrapping up, coming back to Sesame Street and Sesame Workshop together, I think what was really useful is this very, very rich family of fonts that we're able to scale across both brands that allows it to feel different but also connected, and then using motion as a way to differentiate them. And then the final case study I wanted to talk about is just sort of capturing a sense of place and context and using a recent project I did for the History Channel, and this is really about, again, in the same way that Sesame Street was about building excitement and a connection, an emotional connection between the viewer and the brand, or the customer and the brand, or however you want to define that other end. It's about taking history, education, and moving from a place of it feeling a little bit academic and dry and stodgy, and for lack of a better word, stale, and to a place of feeling really empowered and exciting and joyful. They wanted to say to their audience, it's fun to learn. It's fun to learn about things that you don't know. It's fun. There's a sense of satisfaction and joy that comes from peeling back the layers. And so this idea of peeling back the layers, digging deeper, seeing through to history, and then also seeing through history to the future and grounding the brand in that sense of place. And so what we did is we took the logo and we updated it so that there was a kind of an old serif that was referencing the legacy and the history of the brand, the heritage of the brand, but then that you had the future seen through that lens. And so we called it the H within the H, and the legacy would serve as a window into the future through the past. And so we create a motion behavior that's all coming out of the thin H. So the H opens, expands, the camera moves through, you're digging deeper, you're learning more, you're peeling back the layers of history, you're uncovering things that you didn't know, and this motion behavior seen through the type and through the H is kind of the core, is grounding you in that. And then just, again, the beauty of simplicity, and the beauty of how that simplicity can really unify a brand. And then here's, again, the H within the H, the core motion behavior, moving through the past into the future, grounding you in a sense of place. And then we also played with kind of things coming from opposite ends, sense of there being a timeline, so to speak, that, they were very opposed to, we don't want to see the timeline, but we want to reference it. We want to get a sense of, the past and the present coming together, and using that logo as an inspiration to do that. And then, so again, the welcome to the world worth knowing was the invitation to discover and learn. And so this is sort of an overview of a brand, really about, uncovering the layers of the past, uncovering the future through the lens of the past, through that kind of heritage in the logo, and then really having a sense of joy and fun in discovery. And so I hope that I've kind of inspired, and obviously motion has become inherent in so many brands, but I think I really am so excited about seeing, even just in the sponsor videos, and seeing how motion is becoming such an integral part in typography and type systems. And I think it's just such an exciting tool. It's one ingredient in a very complicated recipe, but I think the potential to really unlock a brand is just so powerful, and is something I'm just really, really excited about. So thank you so much.